Mitch, how you doing, man? How was summer?
It's good, Aaron. Really good. Lots of house projects. Some work sprinkled in there. Obviously, a trip to Michigan to see you guys there at Ann Arbor. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. But I find like the older I get, the quicker the off seasons are. So
Isn't that
I
the truth?
try to cherish the time with family and friends and stuff that needs to get done.
You mentioned home projects. Are you a DIY guy?
Yeah, I became that this summer. Um, I didn't think I'd be capable of it, but the beauty nowadays is you can go on YouTube and pretty much solve
It's
whatever you need to
amazing.
have solved, and I've saved myself a few bucks there on that end.
Yeah, I've got a very handy father-in-law, and early in my marriage, I felt a lot of shame, but I've been really trying to every time he comes over, I try and tackle a project and show off a little bit. But it's definitely all credit goes to YouTube.
Yeah, big time. One thing my girlfriend and I have kind of gone through with the house in Arizona is like, hey, whatever needs to be done inside, that's your area. If I need to hang something or whatever, build something,
Sure.
no problem. But the decor, anything, that's her responsibility outside. That's my area, which is great because I'm out in the heat all day long and just making sure everything's tip top shape for visitors and whatnot.
Oh man, that's how you delegate. Um,
Yeah,
Speaking of being home in Arizona, so we had a call last year, and I believe you were in Oklahoma. If I recall, your girlfriend was in the
yeah,
car with you, and you were driving back to Arizona. And I mean, there's a lot of cool spots in the States that are certainly on my bucket list. I don't know if I'll get to all of them. But for example, like I recall Ben Cooper, who when he was coaching in Florida, at the start and end of every season, he'd have a road trip. He'd drive to and from Miami, and they would turn into like these odysseys. Like had so many cool experiences. Like he spent a couple nights in Joshua Tree, and he'd plan these routes. So my question is, you're a veteran of this to a certain extent. What might be some of the experiences or places you visited where you're like, man, like if I wasn't coaching, I'd probably never get to this.
Whew. That's a good question. For us at the end of last year, it was let's get home as quickly as possible. Let's turn the brain off here for a couple weeks from the craziness the season provides, and so we just kind of hustled our what's home. So it was a quick trip. Cover Arkansas, you cover Tennessee, you cover Oklahoma, you cover the Upper Panhandle in
Yeah,
Texas. You cover New Mexico, and then you're in Arizona. So that was kind of our trip home. Now on the way back here, 10 days ago, the one place like that we were really looking at on our list was Nashville. And
yeah,
my girlfriend had never spent any time in Nashville. I've had the obviously luxury of spending some time there in draft last year,
sure.
and then obviously during the season. So it was a quick trip. We drove for about ten hours that day. So we kind of got in, checked into the hotel. I said, "Do your thing. Let's get her moving." And we ended up on Broadway for a bit and met up with some friends. So it was good. To be honest with you, Aaron, I've been all over the country. I've driven all over the country, flown. I played in the American League on the East Coast years ago.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of places I haven't covered in this country now, especially being in this league and traveling around as much as we do. So it's hard for me to really answer that question. I mean, there's hot spots that you enjoy to be at, and some that you don't. But I mean, we actually enjoyed driving. It was just it's peaceful. You kind of
Totally.
get to catch up on things that maybe you skip out on in the perfect relationship and just talking about life and stories. So it was a lot of fun actually, both road trips.
That's awesome. You mentioned the craziness of the season, and it goes without saying that coaches, particularly at your level and the last few stops you've had, they grind and it's intense. And I think it's an intensity that maybe few fans don't appreciate, and it certainly differs from being a player. But with that being said, having spent your first year in the National Hockey League, how does that differ? I would have to think that there's some nuance that, while it's the same game, it's approximately the same number of games in the schedule. What can't you prepare for unless you go through it?
Well, I think the schedule is one thing when people ask me this question, Aaron, is a big one. I mean, it's your preparation. I mean, yeah, I think if you find any good coach or talk to any good coach, they're they're well prepared. And I think at this level, you almost got to be one or two steps ahead of the game, depending on your area that you're involved in, on your staff, because it just goes so quickly. You know, you're playing a game on a Tuesday night at home, and then you're on the plane after the game, and you're in New Jersey the next night. And as a coach, you gotta. There's going to be some things that happen in that game on a Tuesday night that your players need to see on the Wednesday night before the game in New Jersey. So it's you got to quickly get through your work. You got to be thorough about it, but you have to be prepared because there's always players are going to ask you, "Hey, can I see my breakout touches last night against the Islanders at home?" And so you got to quickly get dialed in after a quick meal and get to work on the plane and or every other day or a long road trip. I mean, there's just a lot that goes into the schedule and making sure that you're prepared as a staff and as an individual on your staff. Another thing for me in terms of going from junior hockey to the American League to the NHL is, I had the luxury of working with a group of defensemen here in Washington last year. Um, the importance of finding the correct matchups. I think it's a big thing. Like in junior, it's a development league, so you're essentially rolling four lines and six defensemen for the most part.
Yeah.
American League, you're basically doing the same thing, development league. You're trying to prepare those kids for the next level. And then but at this league, it's depending on the scenario you're in or the situation you're in organizationally, to win, rebuild, this and that, you have to have the right people on the ice at the right time against the right players. Because at this in this league, it's the margin for error on mistakes or wrong matchups, they end up in the back of your net. So that was one thing I learned
Yeah.
early on that was very important. And you got to be smart, you got to be sharp, you got to see what's coming out, you got to do your homework. What's that coach's tendencies coming out of special teams? I think there's a lot that goes into that, and then obviously the performance of your players and the analytics that are available to you too. Like, is this set of defensemen good against this line historically? There's lots of factors in it, but those are two major things for me that was a bit of an adjustment coming to this league.
It's funny you say. I never thought about that, and I think what's probably unique about your situation is, your head coach Spencer was new as well, and I don't know how much time you get to adjust to that, but it makes me think. Gosh, Bill Belichick was on the Pat McAfee show this week, and they were asking him about what goes into preparation. And I don't know if you're familiar with Ernie Adams. He was like Bill's right hand guy. Went to high school with him. Was up in the booth, and he talked about. And I think just if you hear him interviewed, like he's just a brilliant mind. And he talked about with Ernie, he's like, yeah, and you just touched on it. It was that he did so much research into the tendency of coaches knowing how they might react to a situation. And while he probably didn't bat 1,000, he was close, and that provided, Bill referenced that provided them such an edge. So my quite like when you're looking at that, is it as simple as saying, well, our second pair of D is going to go against their second and third line, or do you take that time and do that research into maybe some of those tendencies and underlying tells?
Yeah, I think as we went through the hockey season last year, I mean, you kind of you find guys that obviously first and foremost you're finding the pair that works well together, the two individuals that is there chemistry there, is there continuity to their game, there, that's one component. And there is obviously numbers historically that go to follow certain matchups. Hey, this guy's just not good against Kucherov. Historically, it's end up in the back of his net. That's where the game's evolved so much is just as quickly as searching names and you know um, their success against certain players you can find just like that. So that's one thing. I mean, And then just again, it's performance based. Is that guy struggling that night? Is it just one of those nights? It's a long hockey season. John Carlson's an unbelievable player. He's arguably a Hall of Fame defenseman. He has nights where the schedule gets to him, and he's played a lot of minutes the night before. So you're maybe finding O-zone faceoffs more so to maybe get some
Yeah.
offense out of him versus a D-zone faceoff. So now you got to use somebody else there. There's a lot that goes into it. There's no doubt in my mind that if you look in this league with the head coaches that have been around for some time, you can almost predict that you're going to face this kind of team that kind of night, and this is how he's going to use his players because historically, that's what that player's done, or that's what that coach has done. Sorry, so there's no doubt that that's a factor, but you know, it's interesting, and I think that's where the game's evolved is the analytics and the numbers that come across our desk on a day to day basis that some coaches get wrapped up in it and maybe it consumes them. Some don't. Some use both, like they use their street smarts and the analytics to tell a bit of a story. But that's the amazing part for me in the game. Even I've coached for 14 years and what it's evolved into.
I want to transition to training camp and how you prepare for that. But first, you mentioned the analytics. You spent the early part of your career. You spent a couple seasons as an assistant coach under Kevin Constantine, and anybody that I've spoken to, whether it's Sonny or other coaches, even as players, like that's just it's a game of math. When you look at where you're at today, do you think that benefited you having that experience, given how the game's evolved over those 14 years?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you looked at Kevin as a coach in terms of like he was almost like the founder of analytics. If you
I know,
really
yeah.
if you peel back the onion a little bit, like that guy. Now he did it manually, or we did it manually as a
I was
staff,
gonna say,
like sitting in a coach's office
I'm
till
sure
2 in the
I'm
morning.
sure on your resume there's a line on the top that says like Excel expert.
Oh yeah, yeah, like or just hey, you got a notepad. Hey, that was a
Yeah.
hit for so and so. So it like he was he was cutting edge in terms of where the game went to or where sports went to, especially in the NHL or in hockey in general for us. And um, I think nowadays these athletes and these players, they're smart guys. They want to know what they want to know where they fit. They want to know the evidence that supports your theory as a hockey coach when you are coaching them. So if I look a guy in the face and say, "Hey, your breakout success rate right now, the last 5 games is below our team average or below the league average or whatever," he's going to say to me, "Show me those numbers and show me those examples." So you have to be prepared as a coach to present those numbers, present your case, not to prove your point or hey, you're right and you're
No.
wrong. It's just because they're smart and they want to know and they just want to be sure of themselves that okay, yeah, you're right. Maybe I'm not doing what you're asking me to do, or I'm not having a high success rate on the breakouts, whatever the case may be, whatever the analytic may be. But these guys got so many different things, and these players now they got the video comes to their phones after games. They can watch all their shifts. They know their game. They played the game. They watched the game on the plane, and then they're going to sit with me the next day and watch a few clips about their game. So they're well versed with knowing where their game's at, but you have to have support as a coach and numbers for them to have them understand your point in terms of what you're teaching.
Um, so you've got some new players this year. If we look at, just you particularly, Jacob Chikrin comes in, Matt Roy, two right shot defensemen. How do you become familiar with their game? And is it I guess, a situation where, do you watch a lot of tape, form an opinion, or do you create that space where it's, hey, you're just coming in as, however many defensemen you have at camp, and we're going to allow the group to sort it out?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you watch film on them, of course. Obviously, I'm familiar with watching those guys play as a fan or in coaching the American League or junior hockey when they started their NHL career. So, you're familiar with what kind of player you're getting. That the next part is trying to place them in the right position to have success. Um, in Matt Roy's case, we know he's a good first pass defenseman, plays the game hard, high intelligence level for the game. Um, can log a lot of minutes, good PK. We know all that. Obviously, he's got to settle into our culture. He's got to settle
Yeah.
into a new city that he's never been into, and other than come through and play, get his family situated. All those factors that maybe the fan doesn't think about
They all
affects
matter.
players. It matters to guys, and so we know we're getting a good player there. And same thing with Jacob. I mean, a ton of personality, a guy that's obviously has battled some injuries over the course of his career that's probably derailed his game a little bit. But we feel as a healthy player there that in his case is really excited to be here. Another change of scenery for him. And so we just got to make sure we place those guys in the right spots on our back end, and then obviously get contributions from the rest of the guys and make sure there's chemistry there in the pairs. And we even had that discussion today as a staff, and in terms of where those guys fit in, and where we'll start with them. And then of course there's going to be performance based or this and that. We might have to make some switches. But we're really excited about those two guys joining our back end.
How do you think about, it would seem like in a lot of decors now in the National Hockey League, like there's sort of room for that one really offensive minded defenseman. And I assume that's because, I mean, they play on PP1, but then I think we're starting to see a trend where teams will build maybe the rest of their core around size and maybe a bit more physicality. How do you think about, because Jacob's coming off a year where he was, mostly healthy, had a great year offensively. I think he had 14 goals. You've got Carlson, who's, still very productive. How do you think about providing two players with those acumens the opportunity to contribute offensively?
Yeah, I think as a staff, probably I can't even say staff. I say it's my responsibility working with the defenseman here and that's one of my main messages to our group at the end of last season and in the off season was we've got to be better offensively. Like
Really?
yeah, we were very low as a whole. We were one of the lowest scoring back ends in the NHL, and I find personally the game's evolved where it's a five-man unit. You need your defenseman a part of your offense. I mean,
Yeah,
that starts from your breakouts coming out of your own end. Are you clean? Are you efficient there? You're joining the attack as maybe a second wave, or you're leading the rush, depending on what kind of player you are offensively. And then in zone, you gotta create shot lanes for yourself. Get pucks to the net. Create some creativity there with your forward group. We've got to be a lot better, and I take a lot of ownership as that and accountability with myself as a coach to teach through video, reinforce to our guys through practice reps and video that we need to be more aggressive without without taking away from our defensive game, which was a big strength of our team last year in making the playoffs, was our defensive play. But we've got to evolve our offensive game. Guys got to take a step. I'm not asking a guy that's a 20-point guy to get 60 points this year, but we've got to take a step in that area. Individually, we have to take a step. If you score two more goals or three more goals
sure.
individually in our back end this year, that's a help for us offensively as a team. So that's going to be a big priority for our game, and we feel like we've kind of got some personnel now where it comes maybe a little more natural to them, like Chikrin you mentioned,
Sure.
even Matt Roy. I mean, I think he had 25 points last year in LA. I think he would probably tell you that that's not really his game as an offensive defenseman, but I think he can evolve into more of a two-way defenseman, and maybe that turns into 35 points for us.
Yeah.
So I think we've just got to take another step there as a back end, and that's going to be my challenge, and working with the guys throughout the season to try to do so.
You mentioned getting shots through. There was a time in our game where the offensive defenseman, with a few exceptions, but we're largely, the player that could just, rip it from the point. And that's, you hope you get, a tip, screen, deflection on the way there. I mean, how offense is created from the point now is vastly different. Defensemen activate; they're much more active on the line. When you're in practice, where does that skill set start? Does it start with the feet, or does it start with the hands, or maybe the head?
Yeah, I think you could probably accomplish being a good offensive defenseman in the blue line with all three of those things.
Yeah,
I always look at it as okay, what am I going to do with this puck before I get it from a low to high? Let's say a guy's
Yeah.
battling his ass off in the corner and he goes low to high to a D man. Have I looked at my next picture that I have when I get that puck? Did I create with my feet a lane to the net? So now I've surveyed what I'm doing with the puck before I get it, and I've also created that lane. So now right there, you've used your head, you used your feet, and then obviously the skill set of your hands. You changing an angle on a guy coming out at you, shooting through a stick, shooting through by legs. There's all those factors that I felt we weren't very good at last year. We got better slightly as the season wore on, but it's something that I think we'll practice. I've got some thoughts on maybe some different ways to practice that instead of your traditional, hey, coaches passing pucks low to high at the end of practice and we're just going to bombs away. I think we've got to find maybe a little more resistance with each other in terms of trying to
Yeah.
find lanes to the net. So it's a lot of those things. And then I feel too, when I watch defensemen in the NHL play, like there's some guys that are they just have a knack for finding ways to get pucks to the net. They might not have a big bomb, they might not have a hard shot. They just find ways to get it through that first layer near the net where it's going to create some sort of offense for guys. The one guy that comes to mind for me, who obviously had a good offensive season last year, and a guy we watched late into June was Bouchard in Edmonton. I mean, he's
Yeah.
got a bomb, but he's also got ways where you can just sift the puck in there and it just creates something. I mean, there's lots of guys, but that's just an example of what I watched the other day.
Yeah. It's funny you say that. Watching him in the playoffs last year, it reminded me so much of like um, a basketball player who catches the ball and doesn't necessarily do a fake, but just has this subtlety to just free somebody and take, adjust 6 inches and get it off. Um, One of the words that came up a ton last year, whether it was on this show, in broadcast, just chatting with coaches, was scanning. And it was funny because just even with the World Cup last year, that was a big and sort of just geeking out on that. That was a word that came up a lot with a lot of the top players. So when you talk about, you know, a defenseman preparing for the puck maybe to come from low to high, how does scanning and just how much attention do you pay just to how they play the game with their eyes? And is that something that you can maybe observe on video in the sense that, if a defenseman's in maybe a bit of a rut, to say, hey, maybe it's just here's an adjustment you can make just to give yourself that extra split second and know where your outs are.
Yeah, well, I think it's huge as a defenseman. There's no doubt. I mean, anybody that's played the game and played that position, that even going back for a puck in your own end of the ice, like scanning, reading the pressure, where is it coming from my inside, outside? What am I doing with this puck when I get it in that situation? I mean, it's critical. I mean, it's very important, that position. Offensively, the same thing. I mean, at this level, you don't have time. You do not have time to get a puck without scanning, seeing your next option, and think that you're going to be an effective hockey player. That's the difference between being a top pair defenseman and a guy that's potentially an up and down option for you in the American League. I mean,
Yeah.
that's how fine line it is, and that's one thing I think through video. Definitely, you can, if you put the ISO cam on that particular defenseman when you're watching video with him. I could tell, show him a clip and be like, hey, all you looked at was the puck coming low to high. You
Yeah.
did no work before you got that puck to create any sort of lane for yourself to the net when you did receive that puck by just watching your head in the video. So I think reinforcement, repetition, through practice, video, and eventually you hope that guys will grasp it. Some are better than others. I mean, some are just headsy players, and it's something that they can naturally do. I mean, John Carlson, he's one of the smartest defensemen I've ever seen. Like, that's just, I spent 1 year in the NHL. Of course, that's probably the answer I would give you.
Yeah.
But when you really peel it back and watch him play every day, he's very efficient. He doesn't overexert himself when he doesn't need to, and he just sees the game he sees the game as a coach essentially, and it's impressive. But I still think any young player or players trying to establish themselves as full-time NHL players can watch that part of their game and get way better at it, and try to help a little bit of their sense for the game offensively.
For any coaches listening that are working with young defensemen, when they're in practice doing drills, is that maybe a detail that you would recommend building in to say, hey, when they're drawing the drill up on the board, say, hey, when you're going to pivot and go back right here, I want to see shoulder check over each shoulder, or would those be things that you can build into drills just to create those good habits?
Easy, whether it's a skill drill that you're doing with your defenseman at the end of practice or in practice. I think one of the best, like the best coaches I've worked with before are coaches that stay on top of their players in practice with those little habits. Like that's what I've seen. I mean, you can show it in team video, you can show it in individual video, but there's so many times, like especially in junior and American League, where you practice quite a bit because it's a bit of a weekend league. So you just got to stay. You got to make sure your staff staying on top of those habits that are part of making you a good hockey player. And if you just go through a practice as a coach and be like, "Hey, we got our 5 or 6 drills today. Here we go, bang, bang, bang. We're going to do these ones." But you just float through the drill and just blow a whistle. Your players will not get better. They will not get better at shoulder checking. They will not get better at, okay, it's low to high, D to D, and I stick handled it twice. No, it's on your stick, off your stick. But if you don't like skate by the player and be like, hey, no dust there, we got to get that puck to the net, or hey, we need 2 shoulder checks, players will just float through practice and go back to the well. So the best coaches I ever worked with, best staffs I've ever worked with, stay on top of their players, not in a disrespectful way, not to be an a hole or whatever. It's just stay on top of them, make sure the habits are good, and then it naturally becomes part of their everyday practice or everyday game.
So with that being said, that's a good segue. So you guys got camp coming up, and every team in your league right now is releasing their training camp schedule. And this just occurred to me. You look at say like the Western Hockey League, where you spent several years. I don't know what the exact number would be, but I'm like, man, like you get like no time to prepare your team at the level you're at now. Like I don't know what I mean. You might have had 4 times as many practices in junior as you would now. So I believe that so much of coaching is what you say no to, because there's a million directions you could go in, but there's only so many practices or so many hours in a day. As you head into training camp, what might be some of the areas, whether it's you coaching the defenseman or just your overall team game, where you say, hey, you know what, this is something that we're going to maybe not prior, it's important, but we're not going to prioritize it as high. And that's the thing we're going to have to touch on maybe once the season gets up and running.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, like we've basically have 3 days of full camp, and then we play our
That's
first
it.
exhibition game.
Wow.
That's it. So it's obviously we're gonna present video to our players about, hey, we're to make this adjustment here. We're gonna we got to remind our guys of what we did last year too. Like we got to go through up and down the rink with video, but you can't cover it in those 3 days. I think for us as a staff, there's no doubt there's priority points for us early in camp, pace of practice, execution, running the right routes, the competitiveness that needs to ramp up early on. They basically our expectations as a team in terms of how are we going to practice, how are we going to play, what are our goals, and then once we kind of break from camp, where we maybe our numbers get down to, okay, guys are going to Hershey now, guys are going back to junior, then we kind of get probably a little bit more specific on, hey, we're making this adjustment in our system, we're going to do that. So the first few games are a little helter skelter in the preseason. And then as you kind of get down to your group and you spend more time together and the numbers are smaller in camp, then I think you can kind of get into the nuts and bolts of, this is really how we're going to play, or this is the changes we're making to system this, system that. But it goes quick. And you're right. Like in junior, it's like that whole month is like all practices and they play 4 exhibition games. And so it gets a little bit, overkill with that, but at this level goes quick. So you gotta get right into it right away, and it's important to let our guys know that.
You mentioned last year. I'd be so curious how you and the rest of the staff viewed last season. You guys made the playoffs. That's awesome. Um, I'm gonna guess that the way you got there might not have been how you draw it up. We talk about there being a lot of stats, and I think your goal differential last year was plus 37. and this is what I found interesting about it. Just again, knowing coaches and how what sticklers they are for details. I could see where it would be so easy for a coaching staff to get caught up in the process and maybe not winning the right way or not getting the results. And my perception with your group at some point, there might have been a conversation where it was like, hey, fuck it. Like, we're here to win games and get in the playoffs. Like, we're not here to look good in the standings. Like, we're just here to win games and get into the playoffs. And I would say that, that mindset, no doubt, sinks, filters down to the players and puts them in the right headspace to, because those last 10 games of the year, that was, man, that was great hockey.
Yeah, it was a wild year, Aaron. I mean,
Yeah.
there's no doubt. Like I think when we sat as a staff in July and then got to camp or a couple weeks before camp started in September, I think we had a certain vision for our team that maybe didn't come to fruition in terms of how we wanted to play or how we
Yeah.
thought we could get our guys to play. And I thought Spencer, as our main leader in this office, did a good job as he quickly recognized that we weren't getting to where we probably needed to in certain spots. And we really had to make a quick adjustment and a quick sell to our players that, hey, we need to play this way to give ourselves a chance to make the playoffs. And then you bring the players into it. They did a phenomenal job. Our leadership group, our character of the main guys that have been around for a long time, won a Stanley Cup here, did a great job of really relaying that message to the rest of the group. We had a lot of young players join us. We had a lot of call-ups that probably weren't even penciled in to be on our roster at any point last year that
Yeah.
played 25, 30 games for us. Um, Rookies to North America, like we had injuries. You could go down the list of the
You guys had
stuff we had to
every
deal with.
reason to be really happy finishing in ninth or 10th spot in your conference. That would have been a
Big time.
bonus. Yeah.
Yeah, and hey, the naysayers at the beginning of the year had us out, and this and that, and I think our guys kind of took that as a challenge because the team had been out of the playoffs the year before. And if you look at stuff that I read and probably you read, the naysayers are saying the same thing. So hey, it's a great spot to be in. We're excited about our team, and on paper right now, we know there's a lot of work that's going to go into it. But again, I think if you ask any of our coaches on our staff, our guys did a great job of burying their nose in the dirt last year and
Love that.
going to work and making the adjustments that we needed to. And that was really a credit to our character and our leadership on our team and the young guys following along.
How did you adjust last year going from being a head coach to an assistant coach?
Good question. It was an adjustment. There's no doubt. I'd spent 5 years in a certain chair, and then I was into this role. Um, I feel I'll be better off coach now in this role in my second year versus my first year. Um, I think spending a year in the league, working with our guys. Obviously, we got new players in here. You got to quickly get them up to speed and whatnot. But I feel like maybe there's a little bit more of a I'm jumping all in instead of like dipping my toes in the water. Where I was last year, kind of learning, kind of taking it all in. Got a great staff here. I learned a lot from Kirk Muller is a veteran coach, Scotty Allen, Carbs had spent 2 years in Toronto. Like there's lots of knowledge here that helped me. But I feel a little bit different mentally this year going into it than I did last year, no doubt. But it was an adjustment. That's he Carbs is great. He takes all our input. He asks a lot of questions. He's detailed. He doesn't ever make you feel like, hey, you're down here and I'm up here. Like
Yeah.
he's really gets us involved, which is great. But there's no doubt it was a bit of an adjustment for me personally.
Yeah. Again, I don't know if this would be accurate. It's just an observation, but I certainly get the impression now, like being a head coach in the National Hockey League, just the amount of responsibilities that you have on a day to day basis. It's you just if you try and micromanage, you're going to sink. Like you just won't be able to
Yeah,
keep your head above
yeah,
water, and it's maybe a bit more of a flat sort of management style that at least that's what the best have maybe adopted or learned to
Yeah.
get comfortable with. Um, Looking back at your time in the American Hockey League, and I know that most coaches, they don't like to talk about personal accolades, but you had a pretty good 2 year run. You won Coach of the Year both years. Your win loss record was excellent. Um, what tools did you add to your toolbox, or what maybe gaps did you fill in your own personal development within those 2 years that, again, with the benefit of hindsight now, you can say, hey, like that really has served me in this next step in your career?
Yeah, that's a great question. First off, I had two great teams. Like the players we had in Stockton and Calgary were great. We had guys fulfill roles and had good years, and we had great goaltending, which is obviously a huge factor in any team's success. So that's first and foremost. In terms of me personally and making the adjustment going from junior hockey, let's call it 2.5 years as a head coach because of COVID, the 1 year,
Sure. Yeah.
and making that jump, there was no doubt I was nervous as a coach. I was nervous going into that position with, if you want to call it, lack of experience, to walk into a dressing room where now I'm coaching guys from 20 to 34, 35 versus the 16 to 20s in Saskatoon. So I was nervous. I didn't know what to expect. I knew the expectations in terms of the league and what to expect and the process and the development component and all that. But the one big thing that I really told myself when I took the job or I went to the American Hockey League from junior was just be yourself, be who you are. Obviously, there's good coaches everywhere. You got to know your X's and O's. You got to know how to execute it. You got to know how to sell it. You got to know how to teach it. You got to know all those things. But the one thing players are really smart about is they don't like phony people.
Yeah.
They don't like just a guy that just comes to the rink and just, hey, I just we're just going to coach hockey today and that's it. The game has become such more personal
Yeah.
in terms of spending time with the players, asking them how you can help, how asking them how their families are doing. It's totally evolved, and that's a communication piece. That's the personality piece, and that was one thing that I told myself. I'm like, hey, I'm just going to be who I am. I'm kind of a sarcastic, fun-loving, witty. I enjoy coming to work and spending time with people that I work with and players and staff, and along the way, you're going to have to push players. You're going to have to push them to find another gear in their game. And there's no doubt I do that and have the ability to do that. But I also know there's a huge human element to it in terms of getting your message across and making the players know that you have their backs or you have what's best for them at heart for you in terms of teaching and spending time with them. And that's kind of how it evolved in the American Hockey League to this point here. And I try to kind of hold that true no matter where I'm at.
You mentioned the salesmanship, and I could see where there's such a contrast between coaching the American League and the NHL. Whereas, in the NHL, part of the salesmanship is, hey, like, particularly when you talk about accepting roles. So in the NHL, it might be like, hey, this might not be the role you aspire to have, but it's the role that's going to keep you in the league, and it's probably going to 10x your paycheck every 2 weeks. Whereas in the American League, it's like, hey, you know, I'm sure the reality is that, to get the call up and to play for the big team, some roles might not support that happening as much as others, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But you still, to be successful, you still need players to buy into those roles. What have you maybe learned about? And I hate to use the word salesmanship, but just
Yeah.
maybe the
Yeah.
communication aspect of how you gain buy-in.
Yeah. I think it's different at those, like it's different in the American League versus this league. I think in the American League you get young kids that come out of junior that maybe high picks and they,
Yeah,
had 100 points in junior, 80 points in junior, and then it's that adjustment to being a first year pro and now I had 30 points instead of 80 or 100. I'm not used to that. So what the sell for me to young players coming out of junior into the American League was, okay, what else do you have to do in a hockey game besides get points? Well, you got to be responsible player. You got to You got to be good in all three zones, and whether that's making the next play to your buddy and putting him in a good spot to create offense, or you're in a shot lane and you're killing a play in the D zone, whatever the scenario may be that happens in a hockey game. Because at the end of the day, what you see with players now, and this has been going on forever, is guys go from junior to the American League, and then they get to the NHL, and they might be a first round pick and they had 100 points, but they go to the NHL and it might be a certain organization they're with. They kind of slip down. Now they're a third, fourth line. So if you didn't learn how to check the game and be a good, responsible player in the American League,
Yeah.
and you still think you're a 100-point guy at the National Hockey League level, and it might not amount to that, you got to be able to do something else to stay in the NHL and have those paychecks. So I think that's the one thing that I really try to teach players in Calgary and Stockton was just make sure you're well versed in other aspects of the game, not just be one dimensional. Because the players that come to the NHL and just accept that, hey, I'm a third, fourth line guy now, even though I was a good junior player, those guys play for 10 to 15 years and have a pretty good living and a pretty good pension at the end of it and all that stuff. So I think that's definitely a sell from as a coach and trying to show the players the benefit of both. And and hey, some guys are able to go 100 points in junior and 100 points in the American League, or 80 points in the American League, 100 points here. But a lot of those guys are making $8 to $10 million a year now. So not everybody can do that. So you got to find ways to be effective as a player and try to find ways to stay in the NHL and have consistency to your game.
I want to ask you about, just going back to the details and analytics, and specifically, aside from say scanning, but what might be some of the underlying um, data, particularly if it's available to coaches at the grassroots level, that might be valuable. But you know, to start, you mentioned you came to TCS Live, our conference at the University of Michigan last June. And I know we kind of went back and forth a little bit on what your topic would be, and finally you landed on I'm going to talk about stick on puck. And like, listen, I totally understand the value in that, but I could also see, I'm like, man, do we have some coaches that are going to come to this and they're like, man, I get to hear from an NHL coach. He's going to talk about stick on puck. Like, that's like going to get cooking lessons from Gordon Ramsay and he teaches me how to julienne carrots,
Yeah,
but I'm sure at your level, like, as you said, the margins are thin. Like those
yeah.
details can make a big difference. What might be some of the other details that you've learned that, hey, like these are, it doesn't matter what role you play as a defenseman, it doesn't matter what organization or time of year it is, like
Yeah.
here's the must do's, shift in, shift out.
Yeah, I've become a big believer in teaching the position, the efficiency of coming out of your own end of the ice. Like, how good of a defenseman are you at breaking a hockey puck out? I think that's a big, big. I don't care what kind of defenseman you are, if you're a stay at home, a rugged, hard nosed, whatever the case may be. Especially nowadays in today's game, these guys are so skilled. They put a ton of time into their craft with their individual skill. You have to be able to break out a hockey puck, or you just spend too much time in your own end, and that leads to minuses. So, I think that's kind of one thing that I've really grown as a coach to kind of believe in terms of like, if obviously there's structure components and putting guys in the right spots for outs and this and that, but the skill of going back and shoulder check and having some deception and slipping it through a guy's stick to a centerman that's coming through, whatever. If you can do that with a lot of efficiency, you're going to be a good defenseman and a reliable one, and not spend a lot of time in your own end. And I think that's one thing that yeah, there's you got to be able to get your shots to the net, and that's that that you can teach that and work through that. But the big one that maybe doesn't get a lot of praise is how good are your D going back and breaking pucks out for your forwards.
Got it. How does that, you mentioned just the little nuances, like slipping pucks under sticks, or finding the centerman through the ice. And again, there was a I mean, the show is called Glass and Out. There was a time in our game where there was, the puck went one direction out
Yeah,
of your zone. We had an opportunity last year. We took some partners out to a Canucks game, and we ended up sitting like right at the glass. and it was a reminder of how fast and violent the game is, and to a level that is not anywhere close to being showcased when you watch it on TV. When it comes to those sort of death plays, breaking pucks out, how much of that is taught through video and maybe just giving the players the confidence, letting them know that, hey, that play's there, you just got to make
Yeah,
it, and how much of that is in practice, perhaps through drills and trying to replicate that sort of pressure?
yeah. Well, I think there's no doubt there's a predictability component, being
Mm,
connected as a team,
yeah,
making sure your centerman's running his right route, making sure your winger is he does he need support low for the defenseman who's under pressure, or does he or he's come around the net, he's wheeled the net, his eyes are up, he's got nothing but time and space. Now as a winger, can I stretch out and open up the rink? Um, and then making little subtle plays through defenders. I mean, some guys are just really good at it, and they're good with this, and they're good with their hands, and they can adjust their hands and bring them into their feet and make those little subtle 10-foot sauce plays or slip plays through sticks or feet. Some guys are just really good at it, and some guys aren't. And I mean, that's kind of the difference between being a first liner and a fourth liner. Like it's a fine line. And but I do think you know we have a skills coach here, Kenny McCudden. Like he's been in the NHL for, I believe this is 10th season now, and I mean he's constantly working with our guys on small area plays, or whether it's our fourth line guys, second line guys, whoever wants to go out and work with them, or text them the night before and says, hey, I need some work on my tight area play here. I got to be able to make that next play. And so we spent a lot of time with that. And um, again, the game, Aaron, you've watched a lot of hockey for a lot of years. The game has really evolved in terms of just individual skill, and how good guys are and how much time they spend on it in season, off season. Um, and I think you kind of see that a little bit with even like the guys that are in the lesser roles on your roster. They spend a lot of time on that stuff in the off season and in season, because if you can't make hockey plays, especially at this level, you will not be able to play. It's just as simple as that. You got to be able to make hockey plays. You don't need to score, but you need to get a puck out on the wall. You need to use your body. You need to use your stick. You need to use your feet. You got to make plays. You got to look for that next play, and if you can't, it's tough to play.
yeah. I think you know I, every major league team now is building batting cages in their clubhouse, so the players, it's not just a warm up, like they're going in between innings and taking their cuts, and I get the sense that probably with the same timing it takes to hit a 98-mile-per-hour fastball, it's probably that same thing. It's just getting those reps in for hockey, and just I love how you said that, the tight area plays. Um, Again, going back to the two defensemen you brought in this year, both right-handed shots. It seems that a lot of teams at all levels are aspiring for that, that even split of lefties and righties. Although that doesn't always seem to show up in the rosters that carry the trophy around the rink at the end of the season. How much is that a conscious thing? And I get that there's a lot of people that make that decision, but how important is that when it comes to the efficiency part of the game?
I've personally been a believer of playing your strong side, lefty righty, if obviously it's doable on your roster.
Yeah.
You try to quickly find. We had times last year where we had to use guys on their offside, and I find it's definitely more tricky. Like defending off the rush, pivoting to that side, offensively trying to get a puck off the yellow and a low to high or whatever, and get it to the middle before somebody takes time and space away on you. There's definitely nuances of it that it makes it a challenge for guys playing their offside. So ideally, yes, you want those things. Um, but I do think it's a little bit more doable now than it was maybe even 20 years ago, because these guys are so skilled now. They do a lot of work on this stuff. They do skill work in their off seasons on their offsides for the
Yeah.
off chance that they end up over there. And obviously, if you're a guy that can do those things, you create a little bit of versatility for yourself when it comes to being a free agent or whatever. Like, there's no doubt that that's part of it. But me personally, I mean, I do like
Yeah.
the lefty righty if you can find that right combination. And I think if you ask maybe 10 coaches, maybe 9 of them would tell you the same thing. It's more difficult to play your offside. I
Yeah.
don't care. There's something in the game that will be hampered that you won't get the best version of that player just because of it's a little more difficult.
No, well said. Well said. Um, as we wrap up here, we're coming off this summer. How do you get better in the summer?
Um, you know what? I talk to a lot of coaches at all levels. Not just hey, I'm going to talk to NHL coaches. I talk to junior coaches, talk to American League coaches, um, about whatever topic may be. Guys will text me, say, "Hey, can we talk about D zone coverage? Or what do you guys do? How do you play it? How do you teach it?" A lot of those conversations. Um, watch a lot of video. I obviously like I'm a hockey fan, no different than yourself, and a lot of people out there. I love watching playoff hockey. Wish we were playing longer than we did, but you hunker down, so you really get to listen to the announcers. You get to watch guys and learn more about the game and the league and what guys can do. Um, there's definitely areas for me as a coach that I'd like to continue to work at and get stronger at. Reading leadership books. I
Any
think that's a
favorites?
big one. I'm not a big reader, and that's where I need to be better. I need to spend more time reading a book and less time on Twitter, and I think
You and me
that's one
both.
area
Yeah.
I really want to grow. I just
Yeah.
I got to devote more time to it. And it's hard, right? Like you're in the season, you want to turn your brain off, but I think there's a lot of times where I'm on the road and I've kind of talked to my girlfriend, I've talked to my family. Where I should probably just turn my brain off and read something for even if it's a chapter,
Yeah.
on leadership and learn more about that. Um, but there's definitely lots of areas I want to continue to get better at, and I'm really excited about this season. My second year in this league and learning more about the players that we have and where we can get to. So I'm excited.
Last one, you mentioned your second year in the league. You're going to be going around the circuit again. Um, by no means am I throwing shade on Abbotsford and Utica, but they're not New York and Miami. Any cities that you look forward to getting back to, or maybe you look ahead in the schedule and say, "Man, I wouldn't mind a day off if we can get one there."
Yeah, the big one, there's a couple big ones. Like going to Utah this year will be interesting, right? Like
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah,
new market, different rink right now based on
yeah,
it being an NBA building, so it'll be a little different. But excited about that. A new
totally.
city to venture. I haven't really spent a lot of time there ever, other than driving through. Um, a big one for me is the mentors trip. I mean, that's you know
What's that?
to be well, we like a lot of teams, each year you bring, whether it's a dad, an uncle, a brother, whatever the case may be. We do a trip as a team where we, it's 2 games, 3 nights on the road. This year we're in Tampa Bay in Florida in November. So my dad's coming from well, he lives in Arizona in the wintertime and in our home, and but he'll be coming from there, and so that's a thrill to bring my dad on a road trip, and he stays in
No
the room
kidding.
with me, and the guys bring their fathers and see the interaction. That's always a fun trip. I mean, that's
That's awesome.
you know, yeah. I mean, that my father's done so much for me in my life and my
Is he still
parents
scout?
and family. He's no longer doing that.
Okay,
He's enjoying the golf, and like I said, he's living in our house in Arizona in the winter, and him and my mom are enjoying their retired life. So, but yeah, that's always a fun trip. And no matter where we're at, what
yeah.
last year was Boston, Florida. This year it's Tampa in Florida. That's always fun. But there's to be honest with you, and I've said this. People ask me a lot of times, Aaron. There's never a bad day being in the NHL, and that's the truth. To be around the people that I get to be around every day, the travel, the way we get treated here, especially with our organization, and I'm sure everybody does it this way in the NHL. There's never a bad day, and I don't take that for granted, and I really enjoy coming to work.
That's awesome. Well, hey, man, that's a great place to close. We really appreciate your support, man, and coming out and joining our community in Ann Arbor and taking time to do this before you guys get in the stew. So thanks again, and best of luck this year.
Hey, man, thanks for all your time, and really love being a part of TCS. You know that, so thank you.